it should be pointed out that the United States has thrown a lot of money at Ukraine in order to continue its war with Russia.
They've thrown a lot of money, but the problem is the amount of supplies has been, the delivery has been sporadic at best. So a lot of money has been appropriated. There have been a certain amount of military equipment that has been provided to Ukraine, but not enough to allow them to really push the Russians out of occupied Ukraine. I mean, this is we have to understand that the numbers look interesting, but you have to look at the delivery dates, and they're always too late. And the numbers that are required, for example, of artillery shells, are mind-boggling. I mean, they're reminiscent of the First World War, where you're dealing with thousands and thousands and thousands of shells being fired daily. And when you look at the weekly toll, it's even more extraordinary. So the United States has allowed its industrial base to deteriorate to the point where it has to go around and ask allies like Japan and other countries to provide them. For example, in the case of Japan, the deal was the Japanese provide Patriot missiles to the United States so that the United States can supply their own Patriot missiles to the Ukraine. Well, that can just get you so far. And then you run out of friends. And this gets us back to Israel now, and why we need to start developing at breakneck speed military self-sufficiency. Even if the United States were of a mind to give us whatever they had, whenever they could, with no strings attached, it would be inadequate, insufficient. And so whether the Americans are withholding supplies conditionally upon our acceding to their egregious demands with regard, in this case, to Hamas, and not initiating a war with Hezbollah. Excuse me, I don't know what's been going on for the past 3 months up there, if not a war. On the one hand, and on the other hand, they just don't have it. Even if they wanted to give it to us, they don't have it. So I was asked recently to address a hypothetical. What if we asked the United States for resupply and they conditioned it in a way that was unacceptable to us? What would our options be? And I thought about it for a little while, and I said, well, allegedly, we are the world's 6th largest nuclear power. And we have to simply sit at the table and look at our American counterparts and say, the choice is yours. You can either supply us what we're asking for, we'll even pay for it, as any ally would do, or we have this other option. I don't want to get into specifics of how that option would be used, but we have that option, allegedly. And people more or less agreed that that would get Washington's attention very quickly. But we don't have people on our side that are willing to play that kind of poker. They're all bought and sold. Our dependence on the Americans was accomplished not only by American arm twisting, but by, I would call it, the treason of our military establishment.
Perhaps we should begin to discuss this point in greater detail. When did this process, based on what you know, when did this process of Israel becoming completely under the thumb of the Americans, when did this begin? How did it begin? Why did it happen? Because from what I know, this was not the case in the 1950s, the 1960s. And what can be done about it now?
In the 50s and early 60s, our primary arms supplier was France. And after 1960, and during the Kennedy administration, there were two issues that then we finally reached an agreement with the Kennedy administration to start receiving Hawk surface-air missile batteries. But Kennedy, we had a real problem with Kennedy, the administration, with regard to our alleged nuclear weapons program in Dimona. And there was a real, I guess the French word is frisson. There was a great deal of friction between the United States and Israel over this issue. And when President Johnson succeeded the slain Jack Kennedy, the assassinated Jack Kennedy, there was an agreement to overlook the issue of Dimona. That Israel would not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons into the region, or even use them for that matter. And in exchange, the weapons funnel opened up in terms of aircraft, A-4 Skyhawks and tanks, Patton tanks, and things like that suddenly started coming in, more of them than had been before. The real problem started with American appropriations, billions of dollars worth of arms that were free coming in. And it was like giving free drugs to an addict. And what happened at that point was it just got worse and worse and worse.
What year? What year did that begin?
Really, we're looking at that point. I look at something like the Lavi as a watershed moment for Israel's industrial relationship with the United States. And this happened during the Reagan administration with Caspar Weinberger as Secretary of Defense, where we had a wonderful domestically designed and produced aircraft, the Lavi, that was to be manufactured in collaboration with McDonnell Douglas. It was regarded at the time as probably the best fighter bomber in the Western arsenal. And General Dynamics, with their F-16, didn't like that. The Lavi probably would have outsold the F-16 in a heartbeat, just because of its tremendous and outstanding characteristics. And so the Americans basically sabotaged the program economically and politically, and the Israeli government caved right in. And from that moment on, we've had problems.
It is my understanding that the problems actually began a long time before that. What you're describing it took place in the 80s. But
correct.
As far as I recall, first of all, in what year were the Hawk missiles supplied by the US?
They were supplied during the Kennedy administration.
So we're talking early 60s.
Early 60s.
And maybe
that's when 60s. It really
but it should be made clear the 6-day war was fought and won in 6 days without any major appropriation of US military hardware.
That war was fought for the most part with British Centurion tanks and French aircraft.
Exactly. That's
Mirage threes.
And when did this begin to change? As far as I'm aware, from what I've seen is that in the US began to supply Phantom fighters in 1970.
During the war of attrition along the canal, Phantoms started to be supplied, mostly because Washington at the time saw the war of attrition within the context of the Cold War. And so you had a Russian air defense system, a Soviet air defense system, being basically put up against American air power. I mean, they were still flying French aircraft, despite France's embargo. They still had them. We still had them. But at the time, you're looking at Phantoms that were used for deep strike missions against Egypt at the time. And that was the time when the real dependence on the United States, both for airframes like the F-4 Phantom and electrical countermeasures, really started coming to the fore. And then, of course, in 1973, the floodgates were open during the resupply of Israel, both with aircraft and tanks and electrical countermeasures, ECM pods, and TOW missiles for the Army. It was 73 was the dam burst. And after that, you started having appropriations used both for Egypt and Israel, military appropriations, as kind of the glue of the peace accords that came about with Camp David. And that just kept building and building and building when the American military industrial complex realized, hey, wait a second, this is easy money. This is all tied aid, or much of it was tied aid. And so it became, in effect, corporate welfare for the American military industrial complex. Now, what's come to light lately was that the Ministry of Defense, our Ministry of Defense, acceded to our demilitarization, where much of the equipment was to be manufactured in the United States, and none of it would be manufactured here in Israel. But part of the aid was supposed to be spent in Israel, and the Obama administration, paid to that, and we went along with it. There would be a decreasing amount of investment in Israeli military industrial projects until there was none. And all that money would then be shifted back to the United States. This was done with the full knowledge and agreement of our military high command and establishment, point blank. They basically demilitarized our industrial base here. And when I would ask over the past 3 years, why isn't this system built here? Or why aren't we developing that? And they said, well, it's a waste of money because the Americans will give us something equivalent to that. And anyway, if we started doing that, the Americans would say, stop. We don't want you making this. And that would be the end of it. So when we address this issue now in terms of military self-sufficiency, we have to understand that it's going to cost a lot of money, a lot. So what do we get from that? Well, at the very least, we get jobs, and we get export possibilities, export models of weapon systems. But we also get one other thing, which is maybe just as important. When people have to pay out of their own taxes for their military establishment, they want to get a return on their investment. What does that mean? It means that if we have a threat on our border or at some distance from our border, we would like that threat eliminated as quickly and as efficiently as possible, so that maybe the military budget can subsequently be reduced, which means our taxes could maybe go down. That's the advantage of having a domestic military industrial base that's capable of offering self-sufficiency. Military doctrine becomes more locally controlled. So the Americans don't want that. And certainly our current military high command doesn't want that. They don't want to fight. I mean, that's what led to October 7th, because the concept was Hamas has been deterred. Bibi, assured everybody that we've got them on Kuwaiti money. So they don't want to, upset the apple cart and lose that flow of cash. And we're buying quiet. Okay. So fundamentally, after 1967, where the doctrine we had at the time was very offensive, and it was not only preemptive but preventive. Later on, that changed, and we became more sedentary and reluctant to do anything more than kicking the can down the road, as they say, or mowing the grass or managing the enemy. And as long as the Americans kept supplying us with equipment, well and good. That was all part of deterrence.
And
Yeah,
anyhow, they're not really as bad as some people would like to make out, because they're really the indigenous people, and they have been terribly wronged, and we are colonialists, correct?
no, I would say,
If your top military brass have been indoctrinated with that kind of drivel,
which
then
they
of course they have. We know that, no question about it. We know exactly the names of the organizations and the funds and the foundations that funded all of this for
could I give
many
you a
years.
quick example of that?
Then how do you expect these people to actually wish to fight and win a war?
They don't. But I'll give you an exception to the rule. Just recently in Khan Yunis, there was a rather large mosque that was found to be an armory. And Finkelman didn't sign off on its destruction. Somebody else did. There's a local commander, brought it down, as they should have, because it was no longer a protected structure. Compare and contrast what happened in Jenin, when a mosque was found to be an armory and a fighting position, and some poor soldier, religious soldier, broadcast the Shema, and General Fox, came down with hobnail boots on it. Didn't do anything to the mosque. Chas v'shalom, didn't do anything to that. This is the example where you got people like Finkelman and people like Fox and people like Gantz and people like Eisenkot and people like Gallant, who are just they're not really professional soldiers. They really aren't. They don't know a first thing about what a professional soldier requires. What they are politicians in uniform. That's all. And woke politicians at that.
They're just one more branch of the deep state.
Correct. It's just one more branch. That's all. Which is why in this next election, people have to understand that we have to rip this deep state up by the roots and dispose of it. And if we have to, start over again. Because if we don't, I don't know what will happen in the future. I know that right now we've suffered a terrible defeat. It was a defeat. And we're on the road to defeat now in Gaza and certainly up north. And so if people just stop and think about it for a while, they'll know that come this next election, they can't accept politicians anymore. They can't accept a Ministry of Defense that is not about fighting and winning wars away from our borders, about fighting or generating a doctrine that doesn't require the evacuation of hundreds of thousands of our citizens from our frontiers. Let the enemy evacuate their population from the frontiers. Why should we? Why? Because that's their mentality. That's why. And I have to say this, and it hurts me to say this, but everybody listening to this should have known this was coming, because the Army was quite candid about it for at least 2 years. They said starting 2 years ago that in the event of a multi-front war, the home front is on its own. In the event of a multi-front war, the northern frontier communities and the southern frontier community would have to be evacuated for unknown periods of time. And that we might not have the resources necessary to actually wage a multi-front war, that we were going to lose on some front. Okay, I'm not making this up. You can Google it
Oh,
yourself.
this
I mean,
is
I'm not saying
no,
you. I mean, people
this
can
is
Google it.
this is known. This is well known, and
Correct.
has been for a long time. However, many people, many Israelis and many people outside Israel, have very deliberately, and some perhaps subconsciously or without forethought and malice, have chosen not to know these things, chosen to
Okay.
ignore and pretend.
Okay. No more. No longer.